Here's what we're going to do here. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, wait a second.
Here we go.
I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share this one.
Awesome.
I'm not going to go into presentation mode. That sucks. Okay. So can you all see this?
Yes.
All right. I called it what a TDD and BDD only because that's been the discussion amongst the teams on Saturday mornings. And so that's what they want to hear about. The idea of this is I'm going to give it a little bit of a broader description about this whole area. And then the idea is that if we can make this work, we're going to try and do some breakout rooms and then do a little exercise so you can all practice this and then come back together again, and then we'll see how we did. This is, for most of us, this is that preferred way of teaching Agile and Agile topics. It's not good to take you through a 130-page presentation. I saw a 188-page presentation today on, on what is Agile. We're going to have 9 pages. All right? So let me get started over there. We'll talk a little, I want to talk a little bit about the background of this stuff. The other thing I want to mention is this is an MVP. So this is the first time I've put this deck together. Take it for what it's worth. I think it'll be helpful, but it's not going to be the be-all and end-all to BDD education. All right? So I'm just setting the groundwork over here. I'll give you a little bit of background from my view, which is that once upon a time, we ran projects using something called project management. And everybody calls this the waterfall process. It's not really, but that's a story for another day. And the big difference from Agile is that we would create a business requirements document, and it would be very, very long and very, very detailed. And then nobody could start development until we ended up with an estimate from the developers who had to understand everything that they were going to do so that they could come back and give you the wrong estimate, because it was never right anyway. When we used to write that BRD, there's this whole process that takes place before we start doing development, which has to do with working with the business and working with the stakeholders. Now, as we got into Agile, we started doing that together during sprinting. But there's that front end of the process that occurs before you sprint. And so how that process works today in Agile is where some of these things grew out of. When we used to write the BRD, we would give specific examples. We would have scenarios upon scenarios with details, with descriptions into what did the field look like and what did the web page look like and where did you put the table and what was the font on the table, and all this stuff would be defined for the developers. Now we're in a collaborative world, and that's how these things evolved. So with that kind of background, so this is the picture everybody always sees, right? They always ask you the question, what is Agile? If you go to an interview, they ask you what is Agile. If you go to Agile education, everybody's got an umbrella picture. My umbrella just has more colors. And what I did over here is I put what I consider to be the major frameworks on the left. And then there are these development methodologies and then Agile methodologies. BDD is business design development, but you have to line all these things up with story mapping and journey maps. If you don't know what some of these things are, we'll talk a little bit about them. And then, by the way, since this is interactive, you can ask me about them. But you can't have a discussion about this without understanding that there are these other Agile things that we do. that relate to development, that relate to creating these requirements and turning these things into usable stories. I put together this chart because, and I stole this from the other deck that I had done, but what I wanted to show on the right is that BDD not only aligns with, but is there in order to work together with Agile and enhance your ability to actually do Agile work. So the definition of it, there's a guy named Dan North, who they say founded BDD. And he said BDD is writing software that matters through continuous collaboration. And when you read that, that sounds like what we defined Agile as. But it's a little bit different because Agile is broader. And this is about writing the software through collaboration. And you'll keep hearing that because that's really the essence of BDD. So BDD is the behavior-driven development, but what it's really all about is collaboration. So collaboration means effective and meaningful communication. And the whole idea is to drive this mutual understanding, getting clear specs, shared ownership across the business between technology, quality, and user experience. So the whole idea here is really based on Agile principles of, in order to iterate, we need to understand what it is that the customer wants. So this ties back into all of that, all the customer focused and the customer centric development. So it's really all about Agile. But this is the piece that takes the business side and the collaboration side and ties it into the development and then takes it all the way through testing. So what really is it, right? So over here on the right, let's take a look at, start from the bottom and we'll go up. So when we were doing waterfall, we were doing RUP, which is an iterative process. Some of the engineers came up with this idea about what was called test first. Test first was about lean. It's about whenever you do a lean project, what you're looking for is let's get rid of bottlenecks. And the best way usually to get rid of bottlenecks, you do two things. You eliminate wasteful processes. And typically what you're doing is then you move the work up to the front so you don't have to do it and repeat it later on. And if you've ever done any work on value stream on the development process, testing is a big bottleneck. Because what happened is more and more, especially with Java, development became the easy part. It used to be the hard part, now it's the easy part. So people can write code like crazy. And now you got to testing and now you got to wait. Now we start creating this backlog of code, which is going to be useless because we can't have a nice smooth flow through the process. So they came up with test first, which is let's do the testing first. And there were a couple of iterations of that. And one of them was, even if I don't have the tools to write a test script, let me go ahead and write my test script manually. I've actually done this with teams doing SAP or doing mainframe work, multiple databases and all kinds of things. Write the test script so that the developers know what it is that they have to actually do. Because even if you go to Agile, you'll still find that you have problems with developers writing and creating what it is that the customer wants, that the product owner really wants. So we went from test script, from test first, and we went into TDD. So TDD is test-driven development. So what happened in test-driven development is you took the idea of test first and said, not only should we write the script first, but we should put it into a tool and write the test in the tool. So this was an engineering idea. This is a developer idea. If I write the test in a test tool, and now as I'm working on the acceptance criteria and I'm adding in pieces of the acceptance criteria into this single function, when I pass the test, I met the criteria, I'm done. I don't have to even go through any more testing because as I was developing, I passed the test. And I know I met the criteria because I passed the test. So TDD, if you think about it, then it's based on a single function, right? After TDD, there was something called ATDD, which I've never heard people refer to, but it actually was a step in this process. So the idea in Agile was instead of just writing the test, I would write my acceptance criteria to be the test. But it's a little bit bigger than just a single function because it's the acceptance criteria for the user story. So now I'm testing the user story based upon writing my acceptance criteria as a test. So that's ATDD. It's this intermediary step. Then you move up to BDD, which is behavior-driven development. So this goes into higher value functional requirements from the user perspective in natural language. We'll talk more about that. But the idea is that because the user's involved and the product owner's involved in writing this thing, let's make it easy on them to write this in plain language, not in code that you're then testing in a tool like TDD, but excuse me, but actually in natural language, just like they were speaking, so that you could understand, so everybody could understand and have a common understanding of what it is that the customer really wants.
All right, so I have a question so that you can take a deep breath, take a sip of water.
Go ahead, you talk while I drink water.
All right. So this is what I've gleaned so far from what you've said. I'm going to write a user story, and I'm assuming I'm going to follow the actor, persona, what do I need, benefit, format. And then my acceptance criteria won't read like a one sentence kind of thing, but it's going to read a little differently so that it defines a test case that I need to do, which is to suggest that my user story reflects a test case, or can it reflect more than one test case? That was the A part of the question. And the B part of the question was, and then when I as the developer finish doing my work, I have in actuality tested it, because if I'm testing before I code and validate after I code it, then someone else doesn't need to test it for me unless there is a separation of duty requirement whereby they may need to perform some other tests. That's what I gleaned so far, and I think you already took your drink of water.
So you're basically right, but I'm going to take you through some of the details to show it to you. What I'm not going to do tonight is take you through all the tool piece of it. That's a page that I left to be developed because then you get really technical. But I'll give you an idea of it, a flavor of it.
Thank you.
But you got the right track. So what do? See, that was a great introduction. Thank you, Ray. So the first thing is to understand that you got to run a workshop, and you got to write a workshop that has the right people. So we're going to get to that on the next page. But you got the customer, the developer, and the tester, and they're all getting together and agreeing. And then you want to, in order to eliminate rework, et cetera, flow of value, et cetera, right? The steps in terms of this thing on the right-hand side, right? We did this in TDD. You write a test that fails, write enough code to pass the test, and then improve the code, right? For those who aren't familiar with the term refactor, that's all it means. So if you've seen it a lot, refactor, it just means improve the code, get rid of duplicate lines and things like that, extraneous lines that you don't need. Right? So these are the three areas that we talk about. You got the customer, right? Customer-centric stakeholders, they understand the customer, the business needs, etc. Development. These are the people who understand the development space and the technology feasibility. And then you got the test side people. So the whole idea in BDD that's different is now we're just not talking about the Scrum Master or the product owner, you know, maybe it's a product owner, maybe with some help from one of the technical people, but you're bringing everybody together when you're starting this exercise. So there's actually a process to this. And they describe it as having three phases: discovery, formulation, and the automation part. So Ray, this takes what you were talking about and they break it into these three parts. So discovery is a big piece of work, right? You got the product owner, the product manager, and they're doing all of this stuff together. They have something called a huddle. So what happens is you start with the business. What's the business need, right? So that's your design thinking piece. And then you're doing journey maps. You know, the whole thing is from the perspective of the user. What does the user do? So in a journey map, and I just started working with Wells on Monday. They accelerated my hiring by 2 weeks, so I'm kind of rushing to get stuff done. But in a journey map, something everybody understands is that you're a customer in a bank, and I've got a credit card, I got a bank account. They might even have, some bonds of mine, and I've got a savings account, and they're holding my mortgage. So now, as a customer, instead of sitting there and saying, gee, how do I make it easier for me just to manage my bank account and make deposits? I've got this broad view of my user journey, which is I go to my app on my phone, and I want to make an investment through the bank. So I want to check my balance, and I want to see how much money I've got there and how much money I've got in my investment account. Should I move money or not? Right? What are the bills that I have coming due? So as a user, I have this whole journey that I'm going to go through, which is much broader than just the way we had it before, based on functions, based on my credit card, based on my bank account. So this is the broader view of the journey map. Now I can take this thing, and now I've got to get together in a huddle. And so the huddle, and I'll show you who's involved in that in a minute, right? But this is where you're going to come up with the user story with acceptance criteria in what's called a GWT format. We'll talk about that in a minute, right? Then you do the BDD stuff. And then you do something, you actually then write definitions, by the way, as a part of this thing. In Lead Six Sigma, we talk about having common understanding of the definitions. It's a challenge. So you really want to make sure that everybody defines everything the same way, right? That's the first part of this thing, is up front. Now what happens is that, okay, I went through this first part over here, and I got my acceptance criteria. But then what happens is there's an initial criteria, but then they're kind of general terms. So there's a phase called formulation, and you resolve the ambiguities, turning the stories, the scenarios, into detailed acceptance tests. The automation phase down over here is where you start to get into the tool piece and putting these things into tools and taking them through the develop test process. I'm going to stop there a second and see if there's a question over here.
I got a question.
Sure.
It seems, and I'm just trying to figure out, like, if you were using a design thinking process, could you tie this into that, or is it, because some of the things seem kind of similar.
So what happens with design thinking is there's a major effort to lay that over Agile and see where does each piece of design thinking fit. And they come close, but they're not exactly aligned, right? So we talk about epics, and design thinking has hills. So we used to have the discussion, is an epic a hill? Is a hill an epic? Are they different? It's not clearly resolved because there's language differences. And so the beginning part of design thinking is before this happens.
Okay.
That's when the business is working with the customers.
Okay.
You can go later on, and then you start to talk about, wait a minute, now I got us doing, the harder one is user experience design.
Mm-hmm.
So what this does, and I'll show you the next page, it says, let's bring the UX designer into the huddle. So it kind of goes into the tail end of design thinking and brings it in together into the development Agile part.
Okay. All right, got it, thank you.
But that's a good suggestion. I'll have to create something that shows the overlap of all these different things. So when you do these things, it's something that's bothered me a long time. So here's the huddle, because this is the key part of this whole thing. You got your developer, your designer, your BA is in there, your Scrum Master's in there. You're bringing in an architect, engineer, you're bringing in the product owner. If you get lucky, you bring in a customer. And in the huddle, you're going to create the stories, scenarios, a verbal description. And then I throw in things that are visuals that help. When I was doing requirements, what I found is that some people are verbal and some people are visual. You want everybody to understand it. So I try to do things with both, but to work with the team and see which works best for you guys. You can imagine as a developer, we want to give them some language, but boy, if we could create a table for them, that would make their life a lot easier. This gives you the chance to do these things together with the developers. So let me go back to this given, when, then. So this is kind of like developer thinking. So this is what it looks like in generic. Cucumber has been around for a bit, right? And you can write these things in Cucumber. It's just a tool. Don't let it scare you, right? It's just another one of these tools. There are, if you do this end to end, there can be up to like 20 or 30 different tools depending on what your language is and what you're doing and what your platforms are and everything. But so, given a precondition, then when some action is performed, then something happens, and now I've got a result. So in other words, so my feature or the user story, you could put this in story language, is I want to do a BDD implementation using Cucumber. Scenario is log into Gmail using a Cucumber plugin. So given the user is navigating to Gmail login page, the user needs to enter username as username and password as password. Then the user is successfully navigated to the Gmail mailbox. Right? It's given, when, then, or if, when, then. And I took this from this website over here, and I put the link in the presentation, which we'll make available to you guys, and you can go to the link, and they have a whole bunch of different interesting things on their website. Why don't we stay here for a second and see if we can come up with some, have a discussion and talk about, can anybody think of another example that would be easier to use and clearer?
Sorry, can you make this a little bigger? The slide, like maybe
Make
put
it
it
bigger.
slideshow.
Yeah, I can do that.
And while you do that, let me give one a shot. And I have a question to follow on to Joe's question, because I know there's people on the call who attend the basic fundamental meetups on Saturday. So I'm going to start with the question, then I'm going to give you the example. So I'm looking at this art and I'm thinking, I'm not going to do sprint planning or any kind of planning, depending where I am, unless I've completed this piece of work, because
So,
I'm not
yeah.
going to assign a user story to a developer to kind of do within a 2-week sprint if I haven't defined this. That's the question.
The answer is yes. This is the stuff that occurs in defining the stories.
Now, during the sprint, I could get together with the group of those people that you mentioned to define it, but it's not going to be one of those things that I expect the developers to complete and deliver for the sprint, for the other people who may have not understood what I was trying to ask. And then the example is, given that I am in a account screen, when I select a line item on the screen, then the system comes back and provides me the detail for the transaction I have selected? Question mark. You can tell me if I'm right or wrong.
All right, so I got a story. Now, if I have that story, within that story, you've got acceptance criteria. You're using this to make sure that the acceptance criteria are understandable. I'm getting some advice over here on how to make this thing large, so I can go ahead into presentation mode.
There you go. Then click on display settings, coach, on the top. There you go. Display settings.
Display settings.
Yeah, and swap it into presentation mode. There we go.
There
We
go.
love you, Nailu.
Thank you, Nilu. I learned something.
Love you.
Or you could just hit F5 and it'll go in presentation mode too.
All right, Joe.
Hey, I'm
Keep
just
going, Art.
saying.
Keep going.
There's always one way to skin a cat.
All right, so I understand where you're going, and you're getting me into the harder part of how this whole thing ties together, right? So this is a slide that I haven't seen, but this is the one we talked about. I'll put it together. So you're the product owner, and now you've been working with your customers, and you know what it is that they want. Now I got to sit down with the development team, and I have to create user stories that the development team can understand.
Right.
So I'm going to have a workshop where I can create not only the user story, but also the acceptance criteria. And I'm going to write the acceptance criteria with some detail. So what happens is, let's say you're using Jira. What you want to do is you want to write a paragraph or two, generally describing what it is that you want to accomplish. right? They don't tell you this in Agile and Scrum, but it's a really good thing so that the developers have an understanding of what it is that you're trying to accomplish, what it is that's going on behind the requirement, so they know where it is you're trying to go. So if this is a story that's a part of a bigger story, then what you want to do is you want to say, hey, this is this function within this other story. And what we're trying to accomplish over here is we're trying to make it easier for the user in order to navigate across our systems. And this is the part of the work that we're going to do is on your bank account and making automated deposits off your cell phone. Right? So give them a description. Instead of just writing down the user story, as a user, blah, 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 here's my 4 lines acceptance criteria, the developer has no idea what they're trying to do. So this is to say, let's write a paragraph and describe it in natural language. And then let's write it in a way that the developer will understand it. So the developer can look at this and say, oh, I have to use logic here. I'm not just creating something that's a simple function, but I'm going to have some logic. And they have a discussion. And the discussion is, what I want to do is look at the time and see if we're going to do this as a breakout, if we're going to have to do it together. So this discussion is, all right, hey, you know what? I want to do a BDD implementation using Cucumber. All right, this is a feature. So the one scenario is you log into Gmail and you're going to use a Cucumber plugin. So we're going to have a discussion with the developer, and you come up with this one statement, right? Hey, when the user is navigating to the Gmail login page, they need to enter their username. Well, if we're having a discussion, you might ask me, well, how do they navigate to the Gmail login page? Where is it that they enter this thing? What if they forgot their password? So there's a discussion that goes on with the team and with the customers that says, oh, wait a minute, it's not just this simple one thing. There's more stuff here. So it ties into the design thinking, but it goes more into user experience, where we want to talk about, what do I really need in order to make this work so the customer is happy? Because if this was just my story and I had a story here that said this and just this, you're not going to have happy users. I could create that single feature, but the features have to come together on a broader area. So you're going to have multiple stories coming out of this that tie together into a broader feature. All right? Because it's a feature, it's not just a single function. And that's where BDD goes. So now I want to ask you guys about this. So there's this scenario. And I want to tell you that I took this exactly right off of a safe page on BDD. We could discuss it here as a large group and see if we can make that work. My thought was to break up into smaller groups, but this may be complicating enough that we need to tackle it as a large group. And I'll take the group's input on that.
Yeah, I would probably have everyone here so that we can work through it. Art.
All right. But I want to hear from more people.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I agree with that as well.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Okay. So before we get further, let me hear some more questions so I tackle them as we go ahead.
And some questions maybe about that first sentence there. It's not clear. It says, we are a car company that wants to build a car that sets the speed based on limit, based on the drives itself.
Oh, that's my typing.
Okay. Just wanted to understand what the.
Yeah, that was, yeah, like I said, I was kind of rushing. They started me working faster than I was supposed to. So
We can kind of write good code, just not great grammar.
So let me help you with what the scenario is, right? So we got a car company, and you know they're moving towards an automated car, right? That's their overall goal, is on a car that drives itself. So this is the one scenario is, I want a car that recognizes that sets the speed limit. So the general scenario is, I want a car that sets the speed limit based upon the actual limit. And I want it to drive itself.
You mean you want the car
I
to
want,
drive?
I want the car to set the speed limit on its own.
So, okay, what you mean is,
But the scenario is it's based on the car driving itself. So look at the story.
So if the speed limit was 55, you want the car to be able to drive 55.
55.
Right,
Okay.
right. So as a driver, I want my vehicle so I don't have to pay attention to the speed limits.
So do you want the vehicle to get that information based on like reading some data out of a Google API interface, or do you want that to be something that reads signs with cameras when it comes by?
So that's the how. So this is how you get into Agile, right?
GPS.
So now I got a huddle going on, right? And I got this story. So what we do is now you bring together the developers, bring together the engineer. In the case of a car, you're going to have an engineer, right? I'm going to have some software involved. I'm going to have, so what you do is you figure out who are the people I need in the room to figure this out. So I might have different engineers. I might have one guy who is expert at recognition, AI recognition software, and it can read signs. And I've got another guy who's an expert in Google Maps and knows that he can take a look at the data that's fed off the API from the Google Map and feed that into the car application and then set the speed limit based on that.
Right.
So you got different people in the room to figure out the how, and they may have that discussion, and based on that discussion, there are going to then be more specific scenarios that come about. So now you're a team, right? So you guys drive cars. What are some of the things that you could think of that you might need to address?
Different scenarios when it's driving on the highway and street.
And then the weather may also be a factor.
Yeah. Weather's going, or things in the road construction, or
the first basic one let's address is when the car speed goes over the speed limit and when the car speed goes under the speed limit. So those two are the first, without saying, scenarios. When the speed is 55 and the car speed goes above 55, then apply the brakes to get the speed back down to 55. And conversely, when the speed limit is 55, given the speed limit is 55, when the speed of the car goes below 55 or 54, 53, whatever we want to set them at, then speed up back to the speed limit.
Okay, I'm going to throw a
Yeah, but aren't there different scenarios that could cause the speed limit to go down if the car's smart?
Weather, construction.
That's where you start. But again,
into all your speed limits. What if the speed limit is exactly the same, but we're going up a hill or we're going down a hill?
Correct.
That's just another, the variable. That's now, what if it goes past the speed limit and a cop radars you? Then what? Does it give a ticket to you or to the car?
Yeah.
What about if you go in reverse? Does that also count?
That's going too fast.
Yeah, that is actually a thing. Believe it or not, Teslas actually have a speed limiter for going in reverse. It's baked into their software.
Right.
Wow.
So let's take one of those scenarios. Let's take the one which says that so when the speed limit when the car exceeds the speed limit by 5 miles an hour, it reduces back to the speed limit. All right.
Right.
How would you write that in a given when-then format?
I would do it more of a percentage of the speed. So given a set speed, when the speed varies above that speed by more than 2%, apply the brakes to get the car back down to the set speed limit.
Exactly.
What if it's an electric vehicle?
Doesn't matter. It's speed is speed, whether it's gas, diesel,
That's
or
true.
Well, wait a minute.
No,
because
electric vehicles don't have brakes. They just come
again,
up.
but again, that's the how. How the car reduces speed is a how. That's an implementation.
Then,
This
well,
is a scenario. When this
Right, this
happens,
reduces speed.
how you do it.
I would never use percentage because if a car is
Yeah.
driving 55, the percentage or the speed is going to be more than if the car is doing 30. So I would be more specific and say,
Then you would have to
Get down
have
to
a scenario
55.
for every speed. So you'd have to have a scenario
And
for
then,
every speed.
what she just said, it's be non-specific. Start with non-specificity, because even applying the brakes is a how. It's if it goes above, and you can use either a number or percentage, then reduce speed. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
reduce speed. You may
yeah, and how hard is it going to press the brakes? I mean, you know,
Yeah, you may not have to press the brakes, right? You might be going up a hill and
you just
stick
cruise
on
or
gas,
something, right?
right? So there are two things that come out of this. The first of all, you can see how really, really helpful having this discussion is. If we hadn't had this discussion, we would think this is a lot simpler than it actually turns out to be. And the second part is practicing which exactly what he said, which is he gave us the given, when, then format. And this, when you give that to a developer, they say, aha, I know how to do that. I can write that code. But that's exactly the idea. You're going to come up with these different scenarios.
Do you, Art, do you typically go as far as to maybe, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with pseudocode, where you kind of structure out what code without real regard to syntax so much, but with the thoughts? I mean, would that be at this level, or is that kind of a level below this?
So then you're going back into how you do this in the tools. So if I come back to this, and I come back to this thing over here, so that stuff goes into that second phase. This first part here is all part of discovery, and then there's this formulation, which I'm going to make this bigger so you guys can see this. All right, so in here is this formulation phase. So we have this discovery phase, and we do this on the broader level. Then in formulation is kind of like the integration between the discovery group and going into the development side. It probably goes into backlog refinement.
So basically trying to figure out kind of in the abstract, what is it we want to do in general words, and then we start to get that honed down a bit more into something maybe closer to code-like or flowchart-like, maybe, before we go off and actually start to write the code. Is that
right?
The concept?
Yeah. Yes, because then there's the automation phase where they're creating code and they're testing it, analyzing results. But this is all run continuously through a whole series of tools that all talk to each other.
So if we were thinking about this as sprints and Scrum, the backlog refinement process would happen in the top row there, and then sprint planning would happen, and all of the automation stuff would happen within the sprint?
Yeah, so the formulation would be the backlog refinement, and this is the stuff over here where I want to write up more about what goes on in before iteration 0, right?
This is all happening at a feature level and not on a story level?
Yeah, this goes on at a feature level, but then what happens is in the backlog refinement, well, when you're defining your backlog and create, in your backlog definition. So what you're doing here is you're taking the stuff that went on before, and then you're continuing to refine it. And then you go ahead and then start building the code. So so coming out of here is when I'm going to have my stories that I can then work on developing.
It seems too that, that could actually, as we could see, that could get complex, like the velocity of a car depends on a lot of things. You want to fit this into whatever your sprint time frame is too. It has to be something like, maybe we have to say, what are we going to do on a car on a flat road, with no other cars around? Maybe that scenario is first in the development cycle.
Yep.
Before you get to what do you do with traffic on 95 and going up hills and, a more complex situation, you may not be able to do that in 3 weeks, right?
Right. So you got to think about so you got to go back into, when am I doing my release planning? When am I defining what it is? When am I going through my my design thinking, right, for my MVP, and then I'm going to iterate on that MVP. So all of that stuff ties into, what am I doing with my agile stories, with my sprints, with my sequencing of what work I'm doing in my sprints. So there's that whole piece of agile that has to occur in order then to be able to then take this thing that we make sound really simple and say, oh yeah, we just have this backlog, and then we refine it, and then we turn it into sprints, and then we just, write the stories, build the code for the stories. It's simple. But very often it's not simple. So that's what this is about.
Yeah, I could imagine, Tesla probably had to start out on a test track and just do something very simple at first, right?
Exactly. So they're building something that,
right.
it may just detect a barrier and say,
yeah.
Don't hit that thing.
Probably even simpler than that. They probably set it up on a testing harness with wheels tied to a motor and measured the variation of the responsiveness of the motors without even having it mounted to a car.
With no people.
Right.
No people. No test dummies were heard in the creation of this BDD scenario.
Right.
Yeah.
So you got to start with the design thinking and figure out your MVP, and then figure out what you're going to do in order to deliver that MVP, and then go from there. And you're iterating on all of this. So you're iterating in this discovery phase. You're iterating on what the scenarios are.
Yeah, and one of the beauties of BDD, when done correctly, the scenarios can automatically be imported into the code. So the developers are not spending their time writing tests in the code as part of TDD. And that is the beauty of it. And when we implemented it, I had the users writing the BDD scenarios once they got the story. So when it got into the backlog for sprint planning or iteration planning, the acceptance criteria were already provided as BDD scenarios. And that took a lot of the work and time off the developers, and they became a lot more efficient and productive. So that's what I really love about BDD. And the users are now more involved, and they think through how they want the system really to behave. And they are more engaged, and the product is much better. And it puts a lot of the work off onto the user.
Yeah,
and
you bring up a really good point, because the genius of that with the tools that Art is describing is that they not only generate code that has those acceptance criteria and stuff fleshed out for the developer, because they're generally templatized and those templates have been tested exhaustively. Guess what you've automatically baked out of your code, folks? Technical debt. You've reduced the possibility of introducing technical debt by eliminating the possibility that your developer is going to introduce it.
That is true.
Think about that. That's one of the geniuses of what Art is sharing with you guys.
Did we just lose Art? I don't know.
Well,
Also, what I loved about it, it was off took a lot of work off the developers and put it onto the users while having them engaged in the product.
Leave it to the project manager to talk about the money savings. Unbelievable.
I think a more important point than the money saving is it allowed the developer not to have to guess, which, going back to Marcelo's point of technical debt, I should have less defects by testing, and I should have less instances where somebody is writing something that is wrong and I have to redo. So I'm increasing customer satisfaction. I'm increasing customer satisfaction, and I'm eliminating some of the guessing and some of that he did it or she did it. No, I didn't do that. That sometimes occurs, the conflicts that sometimes occurs that can destroy morale. Right, Marcelo? I didn't mention anything about money.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Because especially as these things fit together and they chain together, because remember, Art was describing a user journey. These things are meant to fit together in a web work, okay? And God forbid you had done some of this stuff manually, and then you start the whole finger pointing thing, right? You know, and nothing works better to demoralize a team than the whole, you know, this way. It was that way, you know. This removes this out of the hands of the team, and so the potential for that just drops to almost nil.
Right.
But that's
yeah.
But that's not to say that the team is not involved, and I think that's what Marcelo's saying. Is just that they're not given the burden of having to figure it out on their own.
So I take this beyond that, because what it starts to generate, what I try to push anyway, is that now the team's starting to sprint. The product owner doesn't go away, and the customer shouldn't go away, right? You've established a working relationship with each other, developing this whole idea and the whole of scenarios. And now you're starting to sprint, and you're creating code, and you want to talk about it the next day. You don't just want to talk about this thing with the Scrum Master and with the rest of the team. You want if you need help from the customer or the product owner, then they should be involved throughout it. I heard somebody today describe the demonstration at the end of the sprint, where the team is demonstrating to the product owner. And to me, you should be demonstrating to the stakeholders at the demonstration, because the product owner should have already been involved and already signed off and agreed that you got what it is that they wanted, if you're communicating throughout the sprint.
So Art, going back to your point, yes, when there are questions, the users will gladly be involved because they create, this is their creation. They have ownership to that. So they will love to have questions, and they'll say, oh, and that might spur, oh, I didn't think of this scenario too. That's what I love about BDD. The interaction, the ownership, that the user is now directly have ownership to what's being produced.
Yeah, what Bob said, because then they figure out, they try to figure it out like a puzzle. Oh, this piece goes with that piece, and what about that piece? And so it turns into this great big puzzle that they're trying to solve collaboratively.
And they're so proud when they figure it out and they deliver it. And they said, this is our system and it's working as we want it. It's just the joy that you see from them being involved.
So Bob, if this is so amazing, why aren't more people doing this?
I think that this is the...
I'm Bob Sarnak, not Karnak the Magnificent. I can't answer that. I have no idea.
I think that this is the next big thing. I've already been on like 2 engagements where they were pushing this idea.
And
you know, it's funny, Art. I had 2 separate scenarios where the answer to that question was Time, I have no time for this from the part of the user community. Because it does take a lot of time to do this. You need to be involved, and that means that this is an additional responsibility to what has been given to you. So,
and the answer to that is, if you want it sooner, we will deliver sooner when you become involved. That's the answer. If you want to wait, okay, let's just take longer. If you want it delivered value quicker, be involved and provide solutions.
Yeah.
So
the other was this is not easy.
Well, it's not so much about that.
And software development is easy. Yeah, right.
It's not easy is it requires a different mindset to begin with. Okay, there is a bit of training, but as you can see, it's not really difficult, right? I mean, in half an hour, it's like, hey, we could start writing. If we had hours, I'm sure we could come up with at least 10, 20 different of these tests for hey, how do we keep this car at 50 miles an hour? And we could keep going ad infinitum. The thing is this, it requires a different mindset to approach this. And
what I heard is it sounds like a cultural change. And
yes, precisely.
That's what Agile is all about. Guess what, users? You are going through a cultural change too, and it's a good one, it's a productive one, and you will love it. But it is a cultural change. That's what I heard. So that's what we sell it. We sell speed and culture.
It is. This approaches it from a different perspective, which is to basically put the customer completely and utterly first, regardless of what development processes you apply. This is putting the customer squarely 100% in the crosshairs of development, and no different.
And Marcelo, we're talking about, this reduces technical debt. Well, reducing technical debt saves you time. So the time that you don't have, you're going to gain back by using this.
Well, yes, technically, if you think about it long term, but the fact is that, to Bob's point of cultural change, most management today are still not thinking in the long game. They're still thinking in the short game. All right. Somebody asked me in the chat privately, well, how many companies are locally using this stuff, Marcelo? And I said, I know of a dozen, 7 that I could speak about without violating an NDA. Okay, that's how few companies in South Florida are truly applying what Art is sharing with you guys. And yet the funny part is that if I were to name some of these companies, you would not only immediately know who they are, know that they're being successful, okay, and now you'd know strategically a little reason why their development teams are being successful.
Yeah. Now, some of it, what happens is that the companies, as they start looking at automation more and more, and as they're moving to the cloud, and as they start putting some of the automation tools in place, then this becomes the natural next step, which is how do we then leverage those tools so we get the most out of them?
And this has been around for a while, hasn't it?
BDD has been around since probably 98, 99, I think, is when Dan wrote the first stuff about it, I think.
Yeah, like so I would think by now it would catch on quicker.
Well, what's happened is that a lot of the tools, see what happened was with all of these things like TDD and all this stuff, it was around for a while. And then as cloud came along, and now you start getting to containers, and now you start getting into, right? Now you start getting into automated integration testing. All of a sudden, how do you leverage those things so that you really get the most bang for your buck? You're putting a big investment into automation. You're still failing user acceptance. Yeah. So what'd you get, right? So this kind of methodology is now coming back up, and they're saying, well, wait a minute, this might work. Let's try this.
I got another question that relates to test-driven development, because I think that is a key to, like Marcelo's saying, reduce technical debt and to get better quality, right?
Yeah.
But from what I understand, and I've been trying to see if I can implement to some of the companies that I previously worked for, but it seems like developers, that's not something that they, are inclined to do. So how do you overcome that stuff? Like, how do you?
So there are So the way Craig Lehrman shows it is that you're a coach and you sit down with the team and you start and you get them to do it together. So that's one way, right? Just like, like if I was going to take this to the next step, we would take an instance of Cucumber and we would write some of this together.
Yeah. I'll share from my personal experience. The way we did it is effectively, we started a book club about it. We got some stuff from Dan. There was another book called Specification by Example. And we started a book club to read it. And we actually started up trying some of this stuff out, just a few of us. And then we did lunches and learns and said, hey, by the way, we tried this stuff. It takes this much less time to do all these tests that took this much time before. And managers caught whiff of that. And then what happens when that happens, when they say, wait a minute, saving money. Yeah.
Okay.
There is one way of implementing this, right? Well, when I was working through, developers were also rejecting from the standard way of development and testing. People like to go through development, QA, test it, UAT, come back to development. It's the cycle everybody got used to. But the management also thought that, okay, Agile is going to make us do faster. But that's a complete misconception in my experience. Agile doesn't make us to do faster, but it's going to help us to release the MVPs in a manner that the business can use it. So without the BDD, even if we write test cases internally without including the stakeholders, like how Art showed in the diagram, different roles. So using them, using the expertise of all the roles, if we create the cases, there is a highly likely chance that the MVP is at least 90% closer to what customer expects.
Yes.
Right? That's what makes us feel that we are delivering faster, because we are delivering something that they can use it as MVP 1.
And that's why, it's kind of an evolution up the steps. If you can, what you can do is just start with test first. All right, I can't get the stakeholders in a room, but we can change our process as a team.
Yeah, I had to take, I had an opportunity to try it out since I had 4 or 5 teams. I tried, okay, this team is ready to take a change. Then they came forward, say, okay, we're going to try the TDD. And the other team, no, we're not ready to do that. So they left behind with the regular way of dev, QA, UAT, and cycle it up. And the other team, which did the TDD, they felt much better after 2 or 3 sprints, because they felt easier in the life cycle of development. Oh, you know what? They're going to test the product for this. They have an idea. And then behavioral is the one much more challenging that I couldn't move much forward, because we didn't know the framework at that time, how to really make the team feel that this is all we are already capturing anyway. So the one positiveness I saw in TDD is they always used to blame on the product owner, not writing the acceptance criteria clearly enough. There is never clear unless we include everybody together. So that's one thing they overcame with the TDD, at least.
Yeah, for the Art and Marcelo, for the team that we attempted to do test first and TDD, the experience of the team was as follows. They were forced into writing Gherkins-like English to understand what it was that they wanted, that the product owner and the users wanted, so that then they could sit down and figure out, what am I going to test, so that I can do the test first, fail it, write the code, then test it again, hopefully it passes, and then goes on from that. Because if you have a traditionally written acceptance criteria, most of the time there isn't sufficient information to actually attempt to do a test-driven or a TDD approach, because it requires some interpretation and some assumptions, which then frustrates the team when they get it wrong, which is why they were hesitant to do it as an experiment long-term if they weren't going to get the involvement of the product owner and the users who were actually doing the acceptance criteria.
So there is a prerequisite, right? You got to make sure that the acceptance criteria are done correctly and effectively and efficiently. So that's why, you know, you start with just having a description of what it is that the customer wants and make sure that they've got really good acceptance criteria. And sometimes you got to bring together the product owner and the team and do a little coaching and get them to work together so that the product owner understands why the team is struggling. So it's evolutionary. One exercise I did with the team to get to test first was just get the team together and say, let's take a look at your cycle time as a team. You're going through this process and now you're getting over here, you get stuck because you got all these developers throwing out code and you only got one tester. So it's taken you, you finished all the code and it's taken you 3 weeks to get the darn code deployed. So let's flow that out on a wall, and you guys put down where the cycle time is going, and you tell me how it is you can solve that problem, and let the team come up with the idea of test first.
Yeah, that was actually a great way of looking at it, because we are all under the impression that what we used to do before this TDD or BDD was the good cycle time. But when we put the TDD in place, the cycle time is slightly reduced because we invest more time way at the beginning than dev QA kind of thing. But the frustrations are less.
The other thing that happened with the team that I did, one particular team, is they started doing cross-training because they realized they needed more testers. So it's always good to take a look at your flow and your cycle time. But you got to get creative in figuring out how to help the team come to these things.
So understand also.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the principles of Agile is simplicity, maximize the amount of work not done. With TDD, you are writing the bare minimum amount of code. There is no gold plating. There is no additional code that you may have to refactor out. So with TDD, you are minimizing the amount of code and probably minimizing the amount of time to write that code. So that's another benefit. And then you have a smaller code base to maintain. So again, let's not lose track of that.
That's right. You want to minimize these things. You know, go back to design thinking and just good development practice.
So Art.
Yeah.
Quick question. This is MC. So here's that nuts and bolts question. Because I get all the gherkin, my team's using it, product owners on board, all of that's working. It's the nuts and bolts about when the sprint starts on, let's say, day 1, day 2, and the team is moving forward as a group, right? We know what the stories are. They've been appropriately written. We've got acceptance criteria. How do you get the testers out ahead of the developers to write the test cases that you need in order to test first? Because then I've got my developers with their thumb up their butt for a little bit of time waiting for that to happen. Do you see it? How do I get that to happen?
So let's think about where you are in the overall process for your project, right? So if it's the first sprint, then call it iteration 0 and spend some time on this before they start coding.
Yeah.
Right? With BDD, the testers aren't writing the acceptance or tests. They are written before you enter the sprint with BDD, and those are imported into the code. So testers are no longer writing. You shouldn't have testers. At most, you should have one tester, and they should only be doing exploratory testing. If it's done right, if you have your TDD where your tests are automated, and you use BDD where they're imported. So all this is done before you even start a sprint. If the story doesn't have this information, it's not ready to be brought into a sprint.
Yeah.
So your coders never are waiting.
Yep.
Okay, I see what you're saying, and I know we had a technical issue that kind of, yeah, that created the problem.
I'm going to propose a different scenario for MC. So Art, help me out here. Help me out here. So we finish sprint planning. It's 12 o'clock. We go get lunch. We come back, and the developer and the tester, they get together, and they start to have a conversation on what we're going to do and what we should test. After that conversation, the tester can write whatever test cases they want, always bringing in the developer to be aware of what they're doing. And the developer is taking the first test case and they're actually executing on the first test case, making sure it fails, writing the code to pass the test case, then validating it, then refactoring to make sure that it follows all coding standards, it performs well, it does all the things that the DoD says it should, and then moving on to the next one.
So one of the things I'll mention is you got to go back to the idea that this is about this is about functions, creating functions. So you may have, engineering stories, you may have non-functional stories. So you may have places where you're going to have testers, where especially if I got to go across multiple databases, and I'm doing something there. So you need to look and see, do I have the right project, and do I have the right functions? Do I have the right specs that I actually can apply BDD or test-driven development to? But test first, you can always work with, and that's where you can talk to your tester. That's why the idea is you get everybody in the room, because you need the viewpoint from the testers. What can we write in this fashion that's going to be a test? Let's get it done there. Now I don't have to go back later on and test any of that stuff. If I get this stuff right, I'm building the test. I'm building to the test, right? So, all of these things are not simple, because you always got to look at the individual situation that you're in, and what works and what doesn't, what applies and what doesn't. What's your platform? What are the tools you have available? These are all things you need to take a look at. And that's why it helps to start this stuff with a good cross-functional team who can have that discussion.
So, Art, I have a quick question, and I hope this doesn't sound stupid.
There are no stupid questions.
Could you use this platform like the BDD for performance testing in Agile?
So my favorite place, performance testing.
Want to try this, or you want me to?
Because I'm about to create a bunch of story cards, and this is so interesting, and I'm like, should I use this?
I would use this and anything you can in order to get people convinced that performance testing is important and needs to get done.
Right.
And if you write it this way and you use common language to talk about the performance tests,
okay,
you'll get people to understand why you're testing, not just what it is that you're doing.
Okay.
I gave an example. I even had hardware engineers writing their tests for modules that were going on our instruments that were meant to work with a particular non-failure level. Talk about performance. It can't fail, right?
Right.
And they wrote their tests using BDD. Okay. They wrote tests using BDD. Okay. Because when we had to have stuff that was repeatable, that was reliable, okay, because it involved humans, okay, we built our testing harnesses with the BDD right from the beginning. Ditched what we were using as the testing framework and started from scratch again using this because it's so much more reliable.
And this would be good even if there's no UI.
Absolutely. It couldn't care less.
Absolutely. Because if you write the story in a broad enough way to start with, you're not going to forget things, right? So you're going to take a look at your network demand, which a lot of people forget when they're talking about, performance and stress testing, right? It's not right because you're looking at how is it actually going to perform on somebody's machine that they're trying to access it.
Okay.
All right, guys. Looking at time, it is 7:30. It's a horrible time boxing here. I hate to break this beautiful. I know the momentum is building, but we did commit to 7:30. So Art, amazing job. Thank you very much for sharing. I'm going to start clapping from my side here. And keep in mind that a lot of other people participated. I love the way the interaction, with Bob, Marcelo, you have a lot of people that came in there to contribute, to give to this great